Welcome to the Great Loop Radio Podcast, brought to you by America's Great Loop Cruisers Association. We're dedicated to sharing Great Loop information and inspiration with those actively cruising, planning for, or dreaming about a Great Loop adventure. I'm Kim Russo. I'm the director of AGLCA. Today we'll be covering one of the many Great Loop side trips. We'll be talking about the Upper Mississippi, which is kind of the road less traveled. A lot of loopers don't head up that way unless they are exploring and taking some side trips. Or, of course, we have some members who start from further up on the Mississippi and join the main route when they get to the Illinois Waterway, Mississippi River intersection. So that's our topic today. Before we jump in, I do want to take a moment to recognize and thank our Admiral sponsors who support AGLCA at the highest level. They are Curtis Stokes and Associates, Great Loop Yacht Sales, Passage Maker Trawler Fest, Skipper Bob Publications, and Waterway Guide Media. As always, we encourage our listeners and viewers to support these businesses that support the Great Loop. And with that business out of the way, I'd like to go ahead and welcome our guest. Dick Heusinkveld is a not quite yet Go Looper because he's doing a whole lot of side trips on the way. I was about to introduce you as one of our Go Loopers, Dick, but Dick and his wife Louise have been aboard for several years working on their Great Loop and really taking the time to explore. So, Dick, thank you for joining me today.
Well, thank you, Kim, for inviting me. It's a pleasure.
Yeah, I'm thrilled to have you because as we were chatting right before we started, you're quickly becoming kind of one of those go-to people when I get questions about some of the lesser explored rivers on the Great Loop, because you're up there with a few other platinum loopers who have pretty much explored every side trip that there is, and you've done many of them at this point. You're actually coming to us today aboard your boat on the Ohio River, correct?
That's correct. Yeah, we're in Marietta, Ohio, heading back down the river.
And that is a long side trip, just not the topic of today's, but roughly how many miles round trip will it be once you finish the Ohio side trip?
Well, we're going to do the Ohio and the Cumberland, so that'll be around 3,000 miles just this 4-month cruising season.
Yeah, so it's a lot of miles, a very interesting and definitely a road less traveled side trip. And Dick and Louise have already been all the way up to Pittsburgh and are on their way back down on the Ohio River at this point. So we'll have to have you come back and talk about that one because that's a very different one. But at this time of year, we often have members who are kind of starting out. Their home port may be on the Upper Mississippi, and they're headed towards the main Great Loop route to really kind of get started. So that's what we'll focus on today. But before we jump into that, tell us a little bit about your cruising experiences so far, because you are working on the Great Loop, but taking your time to do it.
Yes, we're in an Endeavor Trawler Cat 44, and which we selected not only because it has a lot of room, but also because it has an air draft of only 14.5 feet. So that allowed us to take it through the entire Erie Canal, western and eastern part, up the Champlain, and of course had no trouble with the Chicago bridges. We bought 9 Lives in late 2016 in St. Petersburg, Florida, coincidentally utilizing Michael Martin as our buyer's broker. Mm-hmm. We'd met him at an intro to looping event in Charleston a few months earlier, where we also met Cindy Lewis, who arranged the financing, and Ken Marks, who arranged the insurance. So that was a great event to attend in our case. We had a bit of work done at Endeavor's boatyard in St. Petersburg, and then we headed down the coast to the Okeechobee in late January, crossed Florida, and made our way up the Atlantic Intracoastal Waterway to Hilton Head, arriving about a month later. This was only a few months after Hurricane Matthew slammed Georgia and the Carolinas, so many marinas north of Jacksonville were not yet back in service. The next few months were a whirlwind of preparations before heading north in May. The idea was to get into Lake Ontario at Oswego, cross to Kingston, and then circumnavigate that lake before retracing our route back to Hilton Head. Before buying 9 Lives, we'd already arranged to meet overseas friends in England for a canal boating holiday in September, so we had to get home before the end of August. So that's a bit longer shakedown cruise than most people do.
Mhm.
we thought it was worth doing. But note to others, boating in the Carolinas in August is not fun. Uh,
It's a
for
lot,
a
well,
variety,
it's hot everywhere.
yeah,
So
yeah, for a variety of reasons, we only got as far as Oswego before we had to turn around. But this extended shakedown did serve to demonstrate that our cat Tucker had no interest in becoming a boat cat. So he now stays with friends while we're cruising. 2018 saw us retrace some of the 2017 route, but included a stop in Norfolk to attend the spring rendezvous. But then instead of entering the Erie Canal again, we took the Champlain route to the St. Lawrence and Montreal. After spending 4 nights in the old town at the excellent yacht club, the Montreal, we headed up the St. Lawrence, the Ottawa River, following that up to Ottawa, where we spent 3 nights on the wall in the center of the city before heading down the Rideau towards Kingston. From there, it was a conventional looper route to Trenton and then up the Trent Severn to Georgian Bay. But here we departed the usual looper path and headed south, west, and then north up the Bruce Peninsula towards Tobermory before heading south along the Canadian shore of Lake Huron to Sarnia and then Detroit. The Detroit River got us into Lake Erie, where we followed the southern route, or southern shore, to Cleveland, Erie, and Buffalo, among other stops, entering the Western Erie Canal in late September. This took us to Winter Harbor and Brewerton, where we'd arranged for heated storage until the following May. Leaving Winter Harbor in the spring of 2019, we headed first to the Two Finger Lakes, reachable by water from the Erie Canal, Cayuga with Ithaca at its southern end, and Seneca with Watkins Glen at its southern end. From there, we headed out the Oswego Canal to explore the Thousand Islands area and the upper St. Lawrence as far as Brockville before turning around and heading back to Kingston. We retraced our route up the Trent Severn, but upon exiting, turned right and followed the conventional looper route through Georgian Bay to Killarney and then the North Channel to Sault Ste. Marie. In late September, we dropped 9 lives off at Drummond Island Yacht Haven, where we'd again arranged for heated winter storage. 2020 was the COVID year, and once it appeared that little of interest would be open in Michigan and none of the restaurants, we decided to stay home, leaving 9 lives at Drummond Island. 2021 was spent circumnavigating Lake Michigan, doing the Michigan side in June and early July, then crossing over to Chicago and then up to Green Bay and Door County before turning around to join the looper pack ready to head down the Illinois River after Labor Day. We had intended to leave 9 lives in heated storage somewhere on the western side of Lake Michigan, making it for a shorter run up the Mississippi in 2022. However, there are few boat yards with a 75-ton travel lift necessary to handle 9 lives' width, being a catamaran, and none of them were interested in one-and-done storage contract. They wanted to keep their space available for the ever larger seasonal contingent and had little interest in serving transients. So, in fact, we ended up going all the way south to Pickwick Lake and Aqua Yacht Harbor, where we could leave the boat in the water without significant winterization being needed, but in the hands of a reputable boatyard for the inevitable maintenance. That brings us to 2022, last year when we did the Upper Mississippi side trip.
So it's a pretty, how many miles I'm guessing you probably know, but do you know how many miles it is that you've covered so far aboard Nine Lives?
I haven't totaled all of the years, but certainly we expect to cross our wake in St. Petersburg in around Christmas 2024, so 8 years after we bought her. And I'm certain we'll have done over 10,000 miles and probably closer to 15 by that time. I know at the start of this year, we had already done 360 locks.
Wow. So this year, as you said, you're doing the Ohio and the Cumberland rivers. Have you already done the Tennessee?
Just back and forth to Pickwick. And so we'll do the Tennessee at the start of our looping season, probably next fall. And I haven't planned it out yet, whether we essentially go up to Knoxville after the fall rendezvous or try to fit the Tennessee in before the fall rendezvous, but we definitely want to attend that before we head down to Tom Bigby to the Gulf.
And just that distance from Pickwick to St. Petersburg before you officially cross your wake, correct?
Yeah, that's all that's left. So we've I guess we've done about 80%, 85% of the normal loop length.
Yeah, I would say so for sure. And we're going to have you back multiple times because there's so many different things that we could talk about with the cruising style that you've done, including cruising in segments. And thank you. The different storage yards you mentioned are all AGLCA sponsors. So thank you for supporting our sponsors, as are the people you mentioned from the Charleston Looper Lifestyle, where you kind of kicked everything off and used our sponsors to find your boat and insure and finance it. So thank you for all of that. So it was last summer, correct, that you did the Upper Mississippi?
Correct.
So tell us about that. First of all, let's start with kind of the broad stroke. What are the overall trip stats for that one?
Um, well, last we cruised in about 4 month segments, and so we did 2,359 statute miles last summer, but that includes almost 900 miles from Pickwick to Alton and back. So the
Mhm.
side trip, if you were starting at say Grafton or Alton, is about 1,500 miles, say to and from the mouth of the Illinois River.
And so from the mouth of the Illinois on up the Upper Mississippi, and that's what we're kind of defining as the Upper Mississippi today. Most loopers, if for those who kind of follow the route along, most loopers will do a portion of the Upper Mississippi from Alton and Grafton to where it intersects with the Ohio River.
Right.
So we're kind of talking about the road less traveled again, the portion that most loopers don't do. So how many days or weeks did it take you to do the trip? And, what's the kind of the end of navigation on the Upper Mississippi?
Well, we were aboard for 102 days, 19 of which were on the Pickwick to Alton segment. So about 80 to 85 days on the on the conventional, say, Upper Mississippi segment. The number of we had 32 travel days on that segment, and 48 locks, going back and forth again on that
Wow.
segment.
And I really didn't realize it was that many locks, but it kind of makes sense if you kind of think about that area you're going through. But so it sounds like you traveled about one in every 4 days or so on average.
Yeah, something like that. We had a couple of delays. We spent almost a week at Port Charles Harbor to have some pump issues dealt with. And then when we got up to St. Paul, we stayed in the Watergate Marina there for 2 weeks, and that gave Louise a chance to fly home for a week of R&R away from me.
Well, I definitely go ahead.
Yeah, I mean it turns out that the airport, as a crow flies, Minneapolis St. Paul Airport, was probably no more than 2 miles from the marina, and yet we never heard a plane or anything like that. The marina almost seems like it's in a remote part of the Carolinas.
Interesting.
It it's but yet it's almost in the center of the Twin Cities. It was really quite remarkable.
That is interesting. So one of the things I want to talk about your specific itinerary and the stops you made, but one of the things that is different about side trips is kind of by definition, the Great Loop route itself, you never have to backtrack. You can continue around the loop and never cover the same piece of water twice. Side trips are rivers that connect to that main route, but once you go to the end of navigation or wherever you're going on that river, you do have to turn around and backtrack. So since you've done a lot of side trips, what do you find is the best way to plan for that? Do you meander up and then, when you're backtracking on the way back to the main Great Loop route, do you just kind of skip through everything, or do you try and plan your itinerary so that you're doing some of the stops on the way there and some on the way back?
Well, we'd had a bit of a dry run with that the year before when we circumnavigated Lake Michigan. So we only had one chance on the Michigan side, and that was north to south as we came from Drummond Island. But on the Wisconsin side, or the Illinois and Wisconsin side, we went north first and then went south. And it just turns out that the major stops on that side are about 25 miles apart. So when we're doing 50 miles a day, we could do every other one going northbound and then fill in with the alternatives southbound. It didn't quite work out that way on the Mississippi, and part of that might have been, well, it was due to a couple of factors. One was that we had an unexpected uh, extended stay in Dubuque, Iowa, so that I could rent a car and drive home to help move my mother into assisted living. We didn't think she would get an apartment that quickly, and so when one came up, we had to change our schedule, and so that meant making adjustments on the return trip and taking some places out of our itinerary. The other reason is that although the dams, Mississippi below the last lock had historic low water, as probably everybody will recall, in the late summer and fall last year. But the dams, they kept the pool levels more or less normal, maybe a foot or two below normal, but that was still enough that a number of the small marinas that are off the river, they had silted up in their mouths, and these are small marinas and boat clubs that don't have the budget for regular dredging, and so we just couldn't get into them, and so that forced a change in the itinerary as well. But the plan had been to stop in different places on the way on the return trip.
And what does Nine Lives draw?
Probably a little over, well, with a full load of fuel, definitely a little over 3.5 feet in fresh water, a little under 3.5 feet in seawater.
Yeah, so not a particularly deep draft there, but yes, the lows on the Mississippi were pretty incredible last year, and it was my first trip through there, but Michael's third, and he was just completely like blown away by the difference in how the Mississippi was perceived, because when the water is at normal depth, it seems like such a wide river. But as shallow as it was, it didn't seem like what you hear about the mighty Mississippi for the portion that we did. We didn't go up where you were, but the portion that most loopers do from the Illinois to the Ohio.
Well, for example, Boston Bar, just upstream from Cairo, where the Ohio joins the Mississippi, is a common anchorage before southbound people go to Paducah. And on our way up, we anchored in there, probably had 5 feet of water under the boat as we crossed the sandbar that then takes you into the creek or into the chute. And on our way back, we took a photograph of it, and that sandbar was at least 4 feet out of the water. So the river down there had dropped, the better part of 10 feet.
Yeah, Boston Bar was one that was inaccessible by the time we got there last year. So different anchorages used, and it all worked out. There were a lot of loopers last year nervous about that because, as you said, a lot of the kind of usual spots to drop the hook for the night weren't really accessible, but there were plenty of others, and it all worked out. And you left Alton and started to head up the Mississippi to the upper Mississippi.
Yeah.
Kind of explain your itinerary from there. What were the main stops that you made along the way?
Yeah, as I mentioned, we had to have some work done. We lost the generator water pump coming up the north of Cairo, and so had to get that replaced. And as far as we knew, Port Charles Harbor was the only boat yard that that could deal with it. So from Alton, we went to Port Charles, and that allowed us to discover probably certainly one of the top 5 towns on the loop, with St. Charles, Missouri. It's a suburb of Missouri, a distant suburb of Missouri that is 10 miles from the Port Charles Harbor. But because we were the only transient there, the marina lent us their courtesy car for 5 days and for our private use, and that let us get into that town, and that was really fantastic. The restaurants, the boutiques, the shops, what they've done with their waterfront on the Missouri River, that was beautiful. Once we got the pump situation resolved, then we headed upriver to Rockport, Illinois, which has the Two Rivers Marina, and I think Gold Loopers, Cal and Sally Logan, that's their home port. So
Mm-hmm.
we were able to see them. We spent spent a couple of nights there. Then on up to Quincy, Illinois, where we stayed at the Quincy Boat Club facilities, and that's kind of strange. It's a boat club without any boats. It's really a social club with a transient dock for maybe 3 or 4 looper-sized boats.
Wow.
But they're they're a wonderful bunch. They've got a fantastic clubhouse that is actually built on steel pilings above the river, and it's got a panoramic view of the river, the chute, and the town itself. And Quincy is another one of those neat towns with a lot of history. Most of it associated with Abraham Lincoln.
Wow.
Then we stayed there for 2 nights. Then went up to Keokuk, Iowa. There's a yacht club there, long concrete dock with a restaurant. That's one of those towns that is struggling to find a new purpose. I guess has a lot of history. 2 days there. Then Burlington, Iowa, at the Bluff Harbor Marina, and we were on the phone almost every day for a week with them as the water levels dropped 6 inches, rose 6 inches, because he was really concerned whether or not we'd be able to get in.
Right.
And we did stir up quite a bit of mud getting in, and we stirred up a lot more getting out 2 days later. And we did not go back there on a return trip because the water had just dropped another foot, and we wouldn't be able to enter it.
Yeah. Well, and how scary was that while you were there? Knowing that the water could go up or down, and down was going to be a bad thing for you. Was there any fear of being stuck there for a period of time?
Not so much, because we could see that the pools, even though the lower Mississippi, or I'd say below Chain of Rocks Lock, was really short of water. The purpose of the dams is to maintain the pool levels above the dams, and so they weren't releasing any water to help out anybody downstream.
Gotcha.
And so we didn't think that the water levels would change drastically for the day or two that we were there, and we were getting some rain at least, so that worked out.
Okay. And then what was the next stop after that?
From Burlington, it was on to Muscatine, Iowa, and they have a town marina that's essentially in the center of town, which is nice. But according to their own Parks and Recreation people, it was poorly designed, so it silts up all the time, and they couldn't take us there. But they had an old concrete wall that the tour boats or large river vessels sometimes tie up to, and they allowed us to tie up there, which was also on a city park and easy walk to downtown. Muscatine is another one of those old towns. At one time, they were essentially the pearl button capital of the world.
It's a unique claim to fame.
They had no fewer than 43 factories making buttons.
Wow.
So strange kind of place, but interesting.
Yeah.
And then 2 nights there, and then it was on to Quad Cities, Iowa, which is Davenport and Bettendorf, Iowa, and Rock Island and something else, Illinois. But four cities essentially close together. And we really struggled to find dockage there, and ultimately we were at the Lindsay Park Yacht Club in East Davenport. And there are several large marinas, but the one at the casino in Bettendorf, they don't spend any money to dredge, and so other than I think a fireboat, it was totally unused and probably has 50 slips.
Wow. Not even small boats.
Not, yeah, not even small boats.
Wow.
There was
Interesting.
another very large marina that looked like it was mostly seasonal slip holders, but it was run by a restaurant, and our take was that the restaurant was only interested in in boaters coming in to eat, not transients for overnight. I ran up there with my dinghy and had a good look around, and that's what one of the guys in the dock said. That they just don't answer the phone for transients somehow.
Okay.
But anyway, we had a great time at Lindsay Park. Very friendly people, and we were able to dinghy into the town has a nice dinghy dock for for seeing the John Deere Museum, and several restaurants in the area. So that's what we did there for a couple of days.
Mm-hmm.
And as we headed further north, we spent one night at Island City Harbor in Cebula, Iowa. There's not too much to to say about that. And then it was the Port of Dubuque Marina, which is probably, well, easily the best marina on the river. It comes the closest comparable, I guess, would be Trentport Marina in Trenton.
That's
really,
pretty high standard to compare it to.
that is, and it's right on the completely redone waterfront. There's a museum there, miles and miles of bike paths along the waterfront. There's a casino. There's a convention center. there's just a lot to do, and relatively easy access, walking or bike riding into the restaurants of the city center. That one is a little bit unique in that it has flood doors, so that when the Mississippi is high, they can close the flood doors, and you're completely protected behind
wow.
behind the wall and those doors.
Mm-hmm. Interesting.
We stayed 2 nights there because we knew we were going to spend a lot more time on the way back.
Mm-hmm.
Then it was Guttenberg, I guess, Municipal Marina in Guttenberg, Iowa, for one night. There's not much to the town, but the marina is nice. And Naughty, Nauti, Naughty Marina in McGregor, Iowa. That one was just under new management, and their slips are perpendicular to the river, and so they really attract a lot of the floating debris. And as we approached, they had to take one of their workboats to drag a couple of large trees out of the slip so that we could get in.
That's not too comforting.
No, and then of course, as we're perpendicular to the current, it's you really have to time it to get into the slip without scraping along the sides.
Right.
But the thing that surprised us was that that they just took these trees, and dragged them out to the middle of the river and let them go. I mean, why not drag them far up on the shore and then chip them or saw them or chip
right.
them or whatever. But
Mm-hmm.
anyway, so one night there, and then one of our favorite places is La Crosse, Wisconsin, and we were at the Pettibone Boat Club, which is on an island actually, and so we had to dinghy across. But La Crosse has a very nice small boat dock on the river wall in the center of town, and so every night we went to a different restaurant, and we were just able to dinghy the 10 minutes or so from the Pettibone Boat Club to the town dock. It's much quicker than it's kind of a long way around to cycle on a busy road, and it's even longer to walk. So taking the dinghy was a great way to do that. Then we had a relatively short trip to Trempealeau Marina or American Marines Trempealeau Marina in Trempealeau, Wisconsin. One night, Alma Marina in Alma, Wisconsin, one night, and then Lake City Marina in Lake City, Minnesota, which is on Lake Pepin. That's a part of the Mississippi that is miles wide and miles long. It's like a giant lake, and we spent a couple of nights there. It's starting to get into suburbs of or distant suburbs of Minneapolis at that point, and so there were a lot of Minneapolis, St. Paul boaters keep their boats there, including a lot of sailboats, many more sailboats than we saw in the rest of the Mississippi combined, because the lake is large enough and deep enough that it can accommodate sailors. But interestingly, the town itself really has very little to offer. And we, after 2 days at Lake City, we went north to Red Wing, Minnesota, to the Old Miss Marina, and Red Wing's another one of those neat towns that you can actually cycle there from Minneapolis, St. Paul. That's they've got old rail beds and levees that have been converted to cycle paths. So it's we didn't do that, but other people have. Then there's a tributary of the Mississippi up there called the St. Croix River, and that is really a boater's river. There are a lot of marinas. It's probably our favorite part of that Mississippi side trip was actually the St. Croix, and on the way up we spent 3 days at Hudson at the St. Croix Marina before heading to the Watergate Marina in St. Paul, Minnesota, which is just below the last lock that you can go through. I think it's lock 2. Lock 1 is no longer working, but we didn't go through lock 2, so we stayed at a Watergate Marina for like I said, for 2 weeks.
It's definitely a fascinating trip up the river, because lots of towns that many loopers never see or even dream of taking their boat to. Let's take a quick break and play a message from one of our sponsors. When we come back, we might touch on some of the highlights, if there are anything different on the way back down, and also any kind of unexpected things that maybe happened along the way, and we'll wrap up with just kind of your take on what might attract people if people are on the fence about this particular side trip, whether or not it's something that they should consider. So we'll be back in a moment. Dawtaw Island, created by nature and reserved just for you. A hidden gem of the South Carolina Lowcountry, Dawtaw Island is a private community catering to the active lifestyle. Golf, tennis, pickleball, croquet, bocce, 33-acre nature preserve, and the full-service Dawtaw Island Marina. Just outside of historic Beaufort, South Carolina, and a short ride to Charleston, Savannah, and Hilton Head. Reserve your overnight stay and call ahead to arrange use of the island's amazing amenities. Marine Tech Services is on site to cater to all your repairs and maintenance. Destination, Dawtaw Island. Visit dawtaw.com. That's DATAW.com. Prop Talk is an Annapolis-based company founded in the summer of 2005 by active Chesapeake Bay boaters. The company produces Prop Talk Magazine, a monthly newsprint magazine focused on Chesapeake Bay powerboating and the lifestyle surrounding boating on the bay. Every issue of Prop Talk is distributed at more than 850 carefully chosen and closely monitored locations throughout the Mid-Atlantic. Prop Talk's coverage goes deep rather than wide, and the magazine celebrates the people, places, boats, personalities, and events that make the Chesapeake one of the world's premier boating grounds. Thanks for reading and supporting the Chesapeake Bay's boating magazine. We're back on the Great Loop Radio podcast. My guest today is Dick Heusinkveld. He is filling us in on his side trip to the Mississippi, the upper Mississippi River, which he did with his wife, Louise, aboard their Endeavor Cat 9 Lives. And Dick, you kind of got us all the way up to the St. Paul area. Any notables on the way back towards the main Great Loop route that you want us to know about?
Yeah, there were a couple of different stops on the way back. We went back up to St. Croix and stayed at the Bayport Marina. Unfortunately, where we really wanted to be was Stillwater, but one of the marinas was being dredged and the other wasn't taking any transients, and so we spent a few days at Bayport and dinghied to Stillwater. It's about a 4 mile dinghy ride, so not, not too bad. And there's some great restaurants and shops in Stillwater, so that enabled us to to see that part of the St. Croix River as well. Another place that on the way back that we stopped at is Wabasha in Minnesota, the Mississippi Parkside Marina, and Wabasha has the National Eagle Center, and it's an interpretive center. They also take in injured eagles and try to restore them to health, and some are used as in discussions and exhibits because they can't fly anymore or whatever. But that was a fascinating afternoon that we spent there. And then another different place was Winona, Minnesota, and what is it? The Billy Joel song, "The Piano Man." Said, there's got a line said, "Man, what are you doing here?" Well, there's a restaurant in Winona, and our first thought after we got to the through the starters and the main course arrives, and what in the world is a restaurant like this doing in Winona, Minnesota? I mean, it wouldn't be out of place in any of the large foodie capitals of the world. It was it was some I just forget the name, Nosh Kitchen and something or other, but just a fantastic restaurant. We spent again spent time in La Crosse, Wisconsin, but then stopped in Marquette, Iowa, where there's a riverboat tour company, and they have a little more dock space than they can use. So we were able to take advantage of that facility, and at that time of year, which is early September, they were only running tours on the weekends, so there was actually no one to take our money. So it was a free overnight, which is just the best kind. And then I think for the most part, we there was a stop in Fort Madison. They had just completed a new town-run marina, and we saw it on the way up. It wasn't in Quimby's guide, but we saw what was happening on the way up, and so we said, okay, we should find out whether they're going to be open for transients on the way back, and they were. They hadn't yet put in power and water, but the docks were brand new, and so it was an interesting stop. They've got an old fort along the waterfront that can be visited, but again, that time of year only on the weekends, so that didn't work out for us. But another interesting stop. And then we were back in Alton, so we didn't, like I said, we didn't have as many different stops on the return trip as we had initially planned.
Right. So tell us, and that's a pretty significant number of miles, a lot of days on a side trip. What are some of the unexpecteds that came up along the way?
Well, first of all, the lock keepers were far friendlier than on the Illinois, which which I guess isn't saying all that much, but we were pleasantly surprised. The other thing that we were surprised by, with reference to the locks, is that we had expected that with the experience at Mel Price that these would be large 1,200-foot lock chambers with a smaller auxiliary lock. But actually, once you get above Mel Price, they're all 600-foot locks and single chamber, with one or two exceptions. And so it meant that the big tows, they had to be split. And so some of these passages, some of these split tow events can take up to 3 hours. But despite that, we had almost zero lock wait time the whole trip.
Wow.
So we were lucky in that respect. I can't promise that everybody will have the same experience.
Right.
And another surprise is that many of the locks had less than a 10-foot lift, and none had floating bollards. So the lock keeper just drops you a line to hold on to, much like on some of the canals. The other surprise, and I guess it was a disappointment, is just the sheer number of small and medium-sized towns and cities in serious decline. These are wealthy outposts in the early to mid 1800s during the riverboat and westward expansion eras. But the coming of the railroads changed that, and the manufacturing consolidation post World War II really put the finishing touches to it. Very few have had the resources or the vision to reclaim the waterfronts as people spaces and encourage the repurposing of downtown spaces into accommodation to support a revitalizing core. The contributing factor is the remoteness. Many of these towns are simply too far from population centers to commute from or to serve as second or weekend home locations. And there were eagles everywhere, lots of pelicans too, and herons. That's a difference from last year to this year. We're not seeing much wildlife on the Ohio, but there was a lot on the Mississippi. Yeah. And of course, where there are birds, there are fish. And so there were loads of fishermen and many fishing tournaments. One tournament organizer had coordinated with the lock for a dedicated 2 p.m. lockdown, and we were there in the lock with over 40 skiffs, small center consoles, and high-speed, low freeboard units during a flash thunderstorm.
Oh boy!
Yeah. The other thing is, and now that we've come up the Ohio, we see it must be a river thing, but the slips are all single width on the coast and in the Great Lakes. Most slips suitable for boats our size, say 45-foot boats, are double width, typically 34 to 36 feet wide. And so 9 lives can take a little over half of that when tucked in with a narrow boat. Not so on the rivers, so we mostly had to side tie to long docks, fuel docks, and T-heads. Mm-hmm. And with the exception of Lake City Marina and Lake Pepin, the marinas along the river are far smaller than most of those on the loop route. So that's a bit of a change. Yeah. The narrowness of the channel, despite great widths of water, AIS was invaluable in avoiding passing or overtaking tows on bends or too short straight stretches. I mean, we don't have a transceiver. We just have a receiver. But but as long as we can see them, we can negotiate over the radio, explain what's happening, and decide to hang back or whatever. Because once you don't have to be many feet out of the channel, and you've got no water under the boat.
Right.
Another surprise was houseboats everywhere, including some 80-foot giants. Wow. They often run right up on sandy shores for beach parties and overnights. And a lot of people, we talked to them at the marinas, and they've never been outside of their pool. They have a 30-mile pool or whatever, and that's all the boating they want is right there. And and although almost everybody had heard of the loop, they knew very few people who had actually done it.
Yeah, loopers certainly use their boats differently than most people who are doing local cruising. We see so many boats that have very low hours, even on older boats, because they just never go that far from home until that boat gets on the loop and does perhaps up to 15,000 miles, like you're expecting, Dick, when you're all is said and done. But kind of as we look to wrap up, tell us, as I said before the break, if somebody's on the fence about whether or not this is a side trip they want to do, kind of give them something that pushes them over that edge and says, let's do this. What did you enjoy the most about your trip up the Mississippi River?
Well, we like to eat, Louise and I, and although we tend to spend time on the fine dining end of the spectrum, there were a lot of places to enjoy. So if you're a foodie, there's lots to see and do, and there's a lot of relatively unique food shops and and local food stuff. I mean, we'd never tried cheese curds until we were in Wisconsin, for example. Although we saw them on the Lake Michigan trip as well. And like I say, there's a lot of local delicacies that we would try. There are a number of places. I mean, we like wandering around the small towns and the cities and such, and the downtown areas, just looking at the architecture and imagining what must have been. You can see what money there once was, and then you read the plaques and you get a sense of the history of the place, and why it existed, why it was founded, what it was in its heyday. And so that's the sort of thing that that we like to do, and we know there are other people that like that as well. We don't actually spend time in museums per se, although I will say there are a couple of great museums, and one in Dubuque, and one actually at the Mel Price Lock, that National River Museum that's there is fantastic, and it's maybe a 10-minute bike ride from Alton or something like that. It's a bit too far to walk, but it's an easy bike ride, and so those are things that you'd never visit those river towns. Even if you're an RVer, you probably wouldn't visit those river towns. So if you have some curiosity over why these places exist, and what happened to them, doing the Mississippi side trip is a great way to satisfy that curiosity.
Yeah. And that's a great place to end it, I think. Dick, thank you for joining me today and sharing all these details about your journey so far, and more specifically, the Upper Mississippi.
You're very welcome. My pleasure.
And thank you to everyone who has watched or listened today. We'll be back next week with another episode of the Great Loop Radio podcast. Until then, safe cruising.